Please join me in welcoming Guy Maddin.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. And I want to thank all my Banff Centre hosts and you for showing up. For my hosts for being, I want to thank my hosts for showing up too. Especially Peter Rake, thanks for the introduction, and Katerina Valjevich, both of you worked hard to get me here and to make sure I found my way to the shuttle at the airport in Calgary. Got here. It's really nice. I like to scare myself in public speaking situations. I never have anything really prepared. I do have some clips here that'll supply some structure, but I find if I prepare a speech or something, all I do is fail to remember it. Anyway, so I'm just going to start in. But I do have this one slide behind here. This show down at the Walter Phillips Gallery is called Hauntings. It was commissioned by the Toronto Film Festival in 2010. That was the year they opened up their brand new film festival facility, self-contained in one building, the Bell Lightbox. It was brand new. Noah Cowan, one of the directors, invited me to install something. I'd never really done much installation art, but it occurred to me I could mix one of my obsessions, which is, then it was an obsession, I'm getting tired of it 5 years later, lost films with their needs. I felt their building was so new, it didn't have much history yet. It just felt, you could still smell the drywall and the paint as the festival was nearing, and I felt that the building needed to be haunted. And that maybe if I made something that invoked, by suggestion, a haunting, that I could help warm up, massage into homier usefulness, this brand new sterile facility. I don't know how successful I was, but I had a lot of fun making these things, which are, and now I can back up, well, they were all based on lost film narratives. When I first became obsessed with movies, I was kind of obsessed with them as a kid and then left them for a while to get obsessed in baseball and things. I'm kind of a monomaniacal person. But in my mid-20s, I suddenly became obsessed with film, good and proper, and have stayed obsessed since. I was struck dumb when I learned that there were such things as lost movies, that there were movies, I'm kind of a completist. I wanted to see all of Alfred Hitchcock's films, but his very first one, the Mountain Eagle, is lost. When I first saw Nosferatu and then later Sunrise by F.W. Murnau, I wanted to see all his movies, but I learned about 8 of his movies are lost, just lost forever. What happens? How does a film get lost, some of you might wonder. Well, in the early years of cinema wasn't yet considered an art form. It was just product, and studios would literally clear off their shelves of last year's product to make room for next year's product. They would throw it in the Pacific Ocean or take it to staff picnics and burn it in massive bonfires because the old nitrate stock really burnt. Sometimes the films would get lost in accidental fires in the projection booth, often killing projectionists and maybe even many people in the audience, which is unfortunate, but they switched from nitrate stock in the 30s after untold thousands of people were killed watching movies. Many of them were lost, most of them were just lost to poor, just shipping errors or no one caring anymore, just being stored the way I stored a bunch of family mementos in the basement until they got mildewy or just started biodegrading, and that happens. Film turns into a vinegar-smelling dust or gel over a number of years, and those films actually have to be quarantined at archives because the decomposing vinegar smell is actually contagious and can start destroying other films. Two of my favorite lost film anecdotes are, there's one film, a Lon Chaney movie, which has since been found. It's called The Unknown, in French, L'Inconnu. It was found in France in a room full of cans of film, all labeled unknown, inconnu, because no one knew what their titles were. But this one happened to be called Unknown. And so it was just, hey, this one's the unknown, you know. And so it was found, and it's one of my favorite movies. It's unbelievable. Then there's Carl Dreyer's The Passionate Joan of Arc, which appears every 10 years on the Sight and Sound poll of the top 10 films of all time. It was heavily edited, hacked to pieces in France when it was released in the late 20s. It was shot in 1927. It was hacked to pieces by French censors who were upset that a Dane had dared to make a story about Joan of Arc. And then its original negative was burnt in a fire. And then, so Carl Dreyer, within 2 years of making the film, had a lost film. So he went back, he still had all of his outtakes, and he reconstructed the film out of his outtakes. And that's the film that became known as the canonically great film. Until 1980, when a print of the original was found in a broom closet in a mental hospital in Oslo, in a janitor's closet. And so now it isn't lost, but that second version that was considered one of the top 10 great movies of all time has now just been, maybe it was just put into that broom closet in the mental hospital, and because no one wants to watch that anymore. Now everyone watches the original. Anyway, there's a million ways to get lost. Some films get lost because for political reasons. Some are suppressed. There's a blacklisted screenwriter named Edward Chodorov who was going to make a film called The Lynching of Elizabeth Taylor. It's not that Elizabeth Taylor. It was a 19th century American troublemaker who was lynched, and he wanted to make a HUAC Red Scare allegory, and that was suppressed. I started to think of unrealized projects as lost, too, at a certain point when I thought of Jean Vigo, my favorite filmmaker, who died at age 29 in 1934 after making just one feature, La Delante, and an almost feature, Zero de Conduit. I love those movies and just what films he could have made. And when I I met his daughter, who's in her early 80s now, and she gave me permission to film a couple of his unrealized projects. And so I just thought that since Jean Vigo himself was a loss, that these unrealized projects were kind of losses. And I started to think more of films that just couldn't be made. They're all the films by African-American filmmakers, like Oscar Micheaux, who sold Bibles door to door and worked as a Pullman porter, full-time to self-finance his films, and then had to rent theater spaces to show them. And then, of course, there was poor storage, and most of his film work is lost, probably forever. There was Buster Keaton, who was in an alcoholic depression in the 50s, and just didn't care about it. He felt forgotten, didn't care about his films anymore, and he sold his house because he had to James Mason, the actor James Mason, and he left all his films behind. But James Mason, what have we here? You know, and he called Buster and said, "You forgot your films," and it's sort of started a little revival. And before Buster Keaton died in 1966, he was much beloved again, but his films are almost lost. So that's how things happen. I've even lost a few films for a while, but they've turned up. It's amazing how easily. There's one film that I'm really sorry is lost. It's I'll get to a clip in a sec, but there are exploitation films that just get lost because their makers were so lurid and so shoestring in their lifestyles that there was just no one to look after them. Ed Wood has a number of lost pornographic films. They're starting to show up, strangely enough, at garage sales. So, there's this guy, Brad Grinter, who made a movie in 1974 called Never the Twain. And it was about, I've read all that survives from it as a poster, but on the poster it says, the story of a man possessed by the spirit of Mark Twain, while visiting the 1974 Miss Nude World pageant. and then there are there are countless directors from Stalinist Russia that just disappeared along with their works. There were women filmmakers. I was surprised when I started researching the world of lost film, that just how many countries had film industries in the first 2 or 3 decades of the invention of cinema in the mid-1890s. But up until around 1920 or so, almost every country in the world was making films, with the exception of many countries in Africa. But almost every other country had something. Bolivia, all the countries in South America had films, and some of them made. Not quite half of the directors were women in those early days, often in certain countries, and it was really interesting to see that they were allowed to work. But before the power capitals of film became, coalesced in L.A. and Paris and Berlin and other places, there was a more democratic feel of just a kind of a spontaneous creation, kind of like the early days of the internet, I guess. And almost all of those, the rate of lost silent films in America is 80%, and it's way higher in other countries. The Philippines, I was surprised, had a silent film industry, and at one point, 100% of its films were lost. Anyway, they've found a couple since. Japan has a really high rate of lost films. I became haunted by this idea that you just couldn't watch a movie by, most authors, maybe some authors have burned manuscripts or something, but most of their books aren't lost, not from the last 100 years anyway. I guess there were some stolen paintings and things, but I don't know, just it seemed like film had this really high casualty rate, and I became haunted by the idea. I needed to see some of these canonical films, and then I didn't even know about some of the other films I needed to see about until I later read about Never the Twain and needed to see that. And I realized the best way to see them was just, it may sound glib, but it was just to make them myself. I thought of that late 19th century craze for Salome, the way Oscar Wilde wrote a play on Salome, Aubrey Beardsley made his drawings, Gustave Moreau, many paintings of the story, Richard Strauss, the opera, and I thought, why not treat one of these lost films as kind of sacred texts, and I can do my own adaptation of them. And then I discovered, as Peter pointed out, that in France, on a visit to France, that a movie screening is just called a séance. And it's because the word séance just means a seating. You're at a séance now. And that the paranormal séances we think of and the movie séances that the French attend have much in common, that everyone gathers in the dark and sits down, and they all kind of want to believe what they're about to see, whether it's something produced by a medium in front of some prop, some paranormal prop, or if it's just someone about to watch a projection on a screen, and that what you're seeing isn't really there. What you're when you're seeing a projection, it's an image of something that once was, whether it was just 5 minutes ago or 100 years ago. It no longer is that way anymore. It's a ghost, and that's what's going on in a paranormal thing. And in both cases, the medium is a mountebank, a charlatan. Both the paranormal jewel-turbaned medium, and Winnipeg was the sort of seance capital of the world, it seemed, or so it boasts in the 1920s, so I'm coming from a place steeped in that tradition, and the film director, him or herself, is of course a fraud, especially ones making documentaries, always trying to bend people, always trying to, hopefully you enchant. And then at the end of both types of seances. The lights go on and you decide among yourselves whether you were enchanted or bored or angered or whatever, so taken in at all. But you do want to believe. So it occurred to me